Testing one, testing one. Check that wine for me, all right?
Committee will come to order. Oops, almost spilled my coffee there. Shh. All right, the committee will come to order. We are meeting this morning to consider two bills within the committee's jurisdiction, H.R. 692, the Default Prevention Act, and H.R. 3442, the Debt Management and Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2015. We will consider each bill individually with a separate opening statement and a walkthrough for each. I'll begin with my opening statement and then recognize Mr. Levin for any opening comments before proceeding to consideration of the separate bills. Any talk about the national debt sounds complicated, but the point is really very, very simple. We owe more than $18 trillion, and we do not have a way to pay for it. In fact, we keep adding to it every day. So when we talk about the dysfunction in Washington, let's remember the single greatest dysfunction is this constant, reckless buildup of debt. That is the biggest threat to our credit rating, because that is the biggest threat to our economy. It's a ticking time bomb. We keep trying to put time on the clock instead of trying to defuse the bomb, and the world knows it. Let's all remember why we have this debt. This year, like almost any other year, Washington is taking in more. We have more tax revenues coming into the coffers. It's taking in hundreds of billions of dollars more. But families are not doing that. Not parents, not workers, not students. They're not getting much of a raise if they're getting one at all. And the politicians here in Washington, they're saying that they're really mad, that they're outraged that people are making less. But too many people are all too happy to keep spending more and more and more here in Washington. So the problem is not that Americans are not paying enough in taxes. The problem is that Washington is spending too much money. So if you're not serious about reining in spending, then I would argue you're not serious about paying down our debt. You can't point fingers. You can't condemn the process. It's like shaming the mailman for your credit card bill. Enough with the blame game. We need a clean break with the past. Let's take responsibility. Let's take control of our future. The bills we are considering today would help do just that. They would eliminate the threat of default. That's the talk that comes up every time we hit the debt limit. Default, 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 and all the market rattling that will happen. Well, we will simply eliminate the threat of default with this bill, and they would signal also a greater seriousness about paying down the debt, in fact. I'm going to let Mr. Marchant talk about his bill later on, and I'll have more to say about the other bill, but at this moment, I'd like to turn to Mr. Levin for any opening comments that he might have.
Thank you, and welcome back, everybody. I'm going to read an opening statement that I put together, but I want to say it very clearly. This bill doesn't remove the threat of default. Essentially, what it says is that if a default occurs, it will be the responsibility of the Republican Party of this Congress. This leads this country to default with your responsibility, with your fingerprints. The inability to govern as defined by the Republican majority is following the same failed strategy over and over again. When you insist session after session in passing unpaid-for permanent tax cuts that are not going anywhere, that's one thing. But your repeated efforts to put at risk the full faith and credit of the United States is reckless and irresponsible and has had real consequences. The first bill before us today would signal that the U.S. does not plan to pay all of our bills on time and in full. It says that once the debt limit prevents us from paying our bills, Treasury must pay our obligations to China and other foreign bondholders first, before American troops, before our disabled veterans, before researchers searching for cures for deadly diseases, before providers who treat Medicare patients, and before small businesses holding contract obligations from the United States. So let us be clear. This is not a bill to address the budget deficit or reduce our national debt. It is a bill setting forth a plan for not paying for obligations that Congress has already authorized. I want to repeat. It's a bill setting forth a plan for not paying for obligations that Congress has already authorized. The bill is reckless and indefensible. Indeed, according to the Treasury Council of Inspectors General on Financial Oversight, prioritizing some legal obligations over others in this way would be very difficult or perhaps even impossible. Treasury's computer systems, they wrote in a letter to this Congress, are designed to, and I quote, make each payment in the order it comes due, end of quotes. Even if such prioritization were possible, it would put China and other foreign bondholders before our own citizens at a time when they cannot afford it. Some of those potentially impacted, as I said earlier, by default, would be military service members, including those currently deployed, doctors and hospitals that wouldn't receive Medicare payments, and hardworking Americans who would not get payments for school lunches, veteran benefits, or student loans. If Republicans proceed on this course, it will be the third time they've done serious damage to our economy by threatening to default. When the Republicans brought us to the brink of default 4 years ago, the stock market plunged and S&P downgraded our credit rating for the first time ever. In 2013, Republican default threats and the government shutdown cost us 120,000 jobs and slowed GDP growth just as the economic recovery was taking hold. How indeed reckless. The GAO estimated that the 2013 impasse cost the U.S. around $30 million due to the increase in the cost of borrowing. It also increased the borrowing costs for businesses and for individuals with mortgages, car loans, and other debts. GAO also noted that it cost us credibility. For the first time in our history, investors concluded that short-term Treasury bonds might be too risky to buy because of the risk of default. That should not have come as a surprise. Simon Johnson, the MIT economist, said in a hearing in this very room that if the U.S. were to default on any obligation, it would have a catastrophic effect on the credit market in the U.S. and much of the world. Without access to credit, businesses would close their doors, unemployment would skyrocket, and our GDP would decline sharply. Secretary Lew wrote in a letter to the Speaker in 2013, and I quote, "Any plan to prioritize some payments over others is simply default by another name." Let me repeat that, and I quote, "Any plan to prioritize some payments over others is simply default by another name." We should be acting responsibly to make sure that the U.S. continues to pay its bills on time and in full. We should not even be considering this bill that would prepare for default, damaging the entire global economy and putting foreign investors above hardworking Americans. I guess I'll reserve now my statement on the second bill until later. I yield back the balance of our time.
All right. Sounds a little like deja vu.
It's deja vu again.
It is again. So the first order of business is H.R. 692, the Default Prevention Act. I'll begin with my opening statement and then recognize Mr. Levin, who just actually spent his time talking about this bill. In some ways, that opening statement doesn't reflect what this bill is. In some ways, it seems to be a defense of this bill, because what this bill does is only one thing. It just guarantees that the United States never defaults on its debt. That's all it does. Right now, when we hit the debt limit, the Treasury cannot issue any new debt at all. That's how the law currently works, even to make a bond payment that comes due. So think of a 10-year Treasury bill that a pensioner, a senior, owns, and when that comes due, they're supposed to be paid, principal plus interest. In the case of a debt limit being hit, that will not be paid, and then we will have a default. Nobody wants that to happen. None of us wants to hit the debt limit. But if the United States actually missed a bond payment, it would shake the confidence of the world economy, kind of like as the gentleman from Michigan described. All kinds of credit would dry up if we missed a bond payment. Loans for small businesses, mortgages for young families. We could even go into a recession. So the point of this bill is not to pick about which bills to pay. The point of this bill is to say we're not going to default. It would simply take default off the table. It requires the Treasury to make good on all debt payments. It says, quote, "In the unlikely event that we hit the debt limit, the Treasury can issue new debt only to pay the principal and interest on our current debt and all obligations to the Social Security trust funds," which, as we know, because we authorize this law as well, is a debt instrument issue. We also tell the Treasury to, quote, report to Congress every week on the amount of principal and interest due, and tell Congress how much debt you're issuing under this authority. That would do a lot to reassure the world economy. That would give job creators the certainty they need. That would make sure that we are not ever going to go in doubt of a default. And that's why anybody who says they're concerned about the risks of default really should vote for this bill. With that, do you have any more comments you want to make about this particular bill? We'll have openings on the marching bill.
Let me just say very briefly, that attempts to put a mask on what the reality is. It's default. With all the consequences, our obligations are not paid. That's default. And you can say it's limited under your bill. What it does under your bill is to make sure bondholders are paid, Chinese and others. But what about everybody else? That's default. And you're trying to squirm out of this by some kind of a technical definition of what is default. That won't work for the American people. And Mr. Chairman, it did not work last time. It doesn't work. And what you're doing is playing with fire, and you shouldn't be doing that. You tried it twice before, and I think you're just blinded by some kind of, I'm not sure what it is. I yield back.
The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 692. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will now turn to Austin Smyth, the Policy Director of the Ways and Means Committee, to provide a brief description of the bill, and I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Smyth.
Mr. Chairman, H.R. 692, the Default Prevention Act, is essentially the same bill this committee reported in 2013. The bill contains the following provisions. Section 1 of the bill contains the short title of the bill. Section 2A requires that once the statutory limit has been reached, the Secretary of the Treasury shall issue debt to the extent necessary to pay principal and interest on certain obligations as defined, notwithstanding the debt limit. Section 2B defines the obligations for which new debt may be issued as those debt obligations held by the public or the Social Security trust funds. Section 2C provides that none of the debt obligations issued under the bill can be used to pay compensation for members of Congress. Section 2D provides that once the debt limit is reached, debt obligations issued to pay principal and interest on debt held by the public or the Social Security trust funds are exempt from the debt limit. And Section 2E requires the submission of weekly reports by the Treasury Secretary to the Committee on Ways and Means and the Senate Finance Committee on the amount of principal and interest due and the amount of obligations issued pursuant to the authority granted in the bill. Mr. Chairman, that completes my walkthrough.
Are there any questions for Mr. Smyth that are technical in nature? Mr. Engel.
Thank you.
Turn your mic on.
Welcome back, Mr. Chairman.
You as well.
Well, someone once said you could put lipstick on a pig, but it's not a lady, it's still a pig. So I will agree with you. If you say this is not default and prevents it, I'll take your word for it, but I just would like to ask a clarification of the bill. If we are unable to pay our debt, this bill will avoid default by providing provisions in which new debt can be created. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But in order for them to issue this new debt in order to avoid default, priorities have to be given as to obligations that will be paid under this bill.
I don't think that's the case. Mr.
I'm
Randall.
asking it this way. When Mr. Levin says that under this bill, China obligations have a priority, over our military and research and troops and all of that. Is that incorrect, what he said?
The way I would characterize the bill is the
No, please, give
No,
me a break.
let the
Is
gentleman-
that
let-
incorrect,
Let
what
the
he
gentleman
said?
answer the question.
I'll let the gentleman answer the question on the chairman's time. Could I do that because,
Let him answer your question on your time. You asked him a question, let him answer it.
but he's not answering, and
He's not giving you the
killing
answer
me.
you want.
I just asked, is the man correct, either yes or no?
And he's saying that's not how he would characterize it. Let's let him finish answering.
Mr. Rangel, I'd rather not make a judgment about Mr.
Okay,
Levin's comments.
listen, I yield back the balance of my time.
Anybody else see questions? Dr. McDermott?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask a question about the relationship between the appropriations process and this bill. Now, the appropriations process, ALEC, allows government agencies to spend money. And this is a bill that's overriding the legislative process and choosing winners and losers. Is that fair characterization?
No, sir. I have the bill right now. The Congress has established a statutory limit on the debt. Once that limit is reached, Treasury doesn't have authority to issue any more additional debt. What this bill does is it grants Treasury, in fact, it directs the Treasury to pay the principal and interest on existing debt obligations, and also to pay principal and interest on any obligations held by the Social Security Trust funds. It does not make any process changes, anything regarding spending authority for other programs. It's restricted to the debt and what happens when we reach the debt limit.
The payment to soldiers and sailors and Marines and so forth, they're protected by this bill?
It doesn't address the spending authority for programs.
Well, would they still get their paychecks if there was no money and we went into this default situation?
The bill only pertains to when we reach the debt limit. In that instance, it provides the authority for Treasury to issue debt and rollover debt and pay interest on those obligations. It does not get into the spending authority or prioritization. It doesn't address any of that. It is restricted to just the debt limit and the authority to issue obligations to roll over our debt and pay the debt service on that debt.
So if I understand correctly, you're saying all it does is protect bondholders. It doesn't protect anybody who's receiving payments, whether hospitals or doctors or soldiers and sailors and so forth. None of them are protected by this. This bill says that the Treasury can issue debt to cover the bondholders, so we don't default on bondholders. Is that correct?
The bill just pertains to debt obligations. It doesn't address other spending.
Explain to me then, I mean, I'm unclear. I guess the government has this debt business they have to pay for. What about all the ongoing obligations? Are they covered when we have no money and we can't borrow for them?
The bill does not address the appropriations process or other laws dealing with spending authority. It's focused solely on the debt limit and gives the Treasury Secretary additional authorities in the event we reach that debt limit.
So you're not saying no, you're just not willing to say yes. We're hanging the rest of government out to dry. There will be no money for the payment of anything else. If we hit the debt limit, and Treasury can now expand the debt limit to pay bondholders, everything else that responds or that expects something from the Treasury is out of luck. Is that correct?
I was asked to do a staff walkthrough of what's in the bill.
Well,
You're asking me
understand.
you're asking me what's not in the bill. I'm trying to focus and just explain what's in the bill and what the bill does.
Will you tell me that the military pay is covered under the bill?
Military pay is not addressed by the bill one way or the other.
So that means military pay, soldiers can kiss their...
If the gentleman will yield, we could talk about everything the government does that's not addressed by this bill. This bill simply is to stop default. That's it. It's a very narrow bill. I think the bill's much narrower than you're thinking. It just
But,
simply
Mr.
says that we
Chairman,
will not
you're
default on our
taking my
bonds.
time to tell me that I shouldn't worry about anything except bondholders.
He's not telling you what to worry about, what not to worry about. He's telling you what is in this bill.
Yes, but I'm asking my questions to find out what the hell happens to everybody else?
That's what fiscal policy is designed to do, and that's what we will have to do on other legislation if and when we come to a debt limit.
When, I mean, the
Would
default
the
is
gentleman
coming in.
yield? Would the gentleman yield?
Yes,
I
surely.
think you should congratulate the chair for protecting staff from having to answer these very pointed, embarrassing questions.
If I recall, when the
I
chair, when the
withdraw
gentleman was
my
a chair, he did
time.
the same
You're
thing.
doing a good job. I wish I could do as well as you under the circumstances that you find yourself. I yield back to you.
Are there any other questions? I think we're going, are you done, Mr. McDermott?
Well, I think that my time
Your
is
time's
just
up,
about
so.
gone, yes.
Mr. Lewis, did you have your hand up?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Gentleman, wait.
Well, thank you.
Let's do a little alternate. Did you want? Yes, I'll be. Okay, let me alternate here. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Smyth, most average Americans understand the difference between what they owe to the bank, maybe for their home mortgage or a car loan, and their operating expenses, what they pay for their kids and the clothing and issues like that. The government also has loans that come due regularly, and then we have operating expenses. Today, some of our members seem terribly confused about the two. This bill deals with the debt that America owes that regularly comes due. And if I understand your walkthrough, this makes sure that as Congress and the President work through these issues, we make it very clear America will pay its bills, will not default on its debt. This bill eliminates any question of whether we will default on our debt, protects seniors and those with disabilities, and it is separate from the operating expenses of our government. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so how we fund beyond our debt what we owe, how we fund our operating expenses, whether it's highways or military issues like that, that's part of our appropriations process that we're dealing with right now with the new budget that comes due here in about 3 weeks. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And so this bill, again, we're trying to slow it all down so we can have this discussion. And so this doesn't replace Congress' responsibility, both parties and the President, to come to an agreement on spending for our operating expenses. That's our responsibility and separate from this bill. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. That's done through the budget process.
And so the focus today is on ensuring the largest economy and the most responsible country in the world addresses prudently the debt that it owes, while legislators still retain the responsibility to both deal with how we balance the budget, reduce our spending, fund our priorities as a country, and ultimately work to pay down that debt. That is a separate responsibility that we still have to address. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Great. Well, Mr. Chairman, this is a very prudent measure. I know it removes some of the hysteria that surrounds the debt ceiling each time we address it, but it actually gives not just the confidence and the certainty that you talked about to those who have loaned us money, but it gives us the space as legislators to have a responsible discussion on how we prioritize our spending and our operating expenses. I think this is a bill that's very prudent for America. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back time. Mr. Lewis, do you seek time to ask some questions? The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Sir, could you tell us whether you were in this position in 2013 when we considered a similar bill?
Excuse me?
Were you in this position?
Was I in this position?
Yeah.
No, sir.
2 years ago.
No, sir. I was working at the House, on the staff of the House Budget Committee.
Okay. So you're not really at home or familiar with what we did or what the majority party did 2 years ago?
No, the staff, the House Budget Committee, examined that bill and reviewed that bill. I'm familiar with it. I've been working on budgets for a long, long time, so I am familiar with the McClintock bill or this bill.
Well, would you agree that with this bill, we would pay China before We send out Social Security checks?
As I've tried to make clear, the bill just deals with debt obligations. It doesn't discriminate among bondholders. It directs the Treasury to pay all bonds and all debt service on those bonds. That's all this bill does. It doesn't get into spending authority for other programs, prioritization. This bill does not address those issues.
Well, if you pay bills as they come, I think China seems to be first in line.
The bill does not set any priority on any payments. All the bill does is grant and direct the Treasury Secretary to make debt payments on all bonds, all outstanding bonds, and the debt service on those bonds.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. Anybody else see questions? Mr. Neal?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Standard & Poor's rating agency indicated that during the last government shutdown, that there was $24 billion lost in economic output, almost 1% of annualized GDP, and Moody's Analytics estimated the impact at $23 billion. Would you agree with those two statements?
I've not examined the S&P analysis. I'm not familiar with the details, but if that's what it says, yeah, I'd agree with it.
Okay.
If that's what it says.
Fair enough. Well, I'm just quoting here from Fact Checker.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. So, Mr. Chairman, at a time when there's great economic uncertainty and slow growth across Western Europe, wide fluctuations almost daily now in the stock market, the consumer class that we had all anticipated in China stalled, and uncertainty across major nations formerly called the BRIC countries, the idea that America, which is recognizing really moderate growth, would be even contemplating sending any message other than confidence and stability to markets nationally and internationally would be a great failure on our part in terms of responsibility. So the professional staff, who I have great regard for, they all know, agrees with the position that $24 billion was lost in GDP and economic output. That's almost 1%. The last time we toyed with this sort of an initiative. We should be sending a certain statement confidently to markets that we intend to pay our bills.
Mr. Neal, if after the amendment process, we will entertain movements to strike the last word. So we can make statements like that at that time. But right now, we're doing the staff walkthrough for
Mr. Chairman, I began with a question.
Yes, I see that.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have a question that is technical in nature about the legislation? Mr. Becerra is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smyth, thank you for your responses and comments so far. Let me make sure I'm clear. Now, America has never defaulted on the payment of its obligations. Our full faith and credit has stood the test of time. You're not aware of any time that America has defaulted on its debt obligations in the past, are you?
No, sir.
Yeah. Everything we've checked is never have Americans, our country, have we ever defaulted on the payment of our past debts. When we have needed to do something, we've done it. If we had to borrow to do it, we've paid back. But if under this Republican measure we default on the payment of our obligations, all of our obligations, this legislation, if it were to become law, would require us to prioritize the payment, as you've said, of principal and interest of debt obligations, correct?
The way the bill operates...
I didn't ask you how it operates. I asked you if this legislation becomes law, under this bill, America would have to prioritize the payment of, your words, principal and interest of debt obligations.
I don't think that's the correct characterization of the bill.
Okay, so let me try a different way. This legislation concentrates on making sure that we pay the principal and interest of debt obligations.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So let's say that Republicans decide not to increase the amount of debt limit so we can pay all of our bills to everyone we owe. If this bill becomes law, if the law says we must pay the principal and interest of debt obligations, that means that any money that we're bringing in must be used to pay that principal and interest of those debt obligations, correct?
It grants authority to the Treasury Secretary to issue new obligations to roll over current debt and any debt service on that.
May I interject?
Debate. No, let
just
me
to clarify?
Sure, Mr. Chair.
It's not prioritization among existing funds. It says they can create a new debt instrument to pay off one that's expiring.
Right, and it's to pay the principal and interest of debt obligations. So as much time as we've consumed, essentially what this legislation says is that if we borrowed money from someone, we have to pay that with money that comes in, correct?
Well, we have to roll over existing debt. It wouldn't draw,
Mr. Smyth, we will continue to receive money because Americans are still paying taxes. What we're saying is that we're not going to collect enough in revenues through those taxes and fees and so forth that we'll need to pay all of our obligations that we have. This legislation tells Treasury that it must use the money that's coming in to pay principal and interest on debt obligations. And if we still don't have enough, then we can roll that over to make sure that we're paying the principal and interest on debt obligations. Correct?
No, the way the bill operates is when we reach the debt limit, at that point, Treasury has the authority to roll over the existing debt. That would have no effect on the debt limit, just to roll over existing debt, because that's wash. When you redeem debt, that reduces the debt subject to limit, and when you issue a new bond, that replaces that debt. So you're right at the same spot.
So you're writing new debt to pay for old debt.
Old debt, and that doesn't
Right.
change the total debt.
So
Any
default
additional receipts
is
that are-
default, and as they said in Hamlet, doth protest too much. This is default. What you're doing is through this legislation saying we can roll over our debt, which simply means we're going to borrow to pay for the old borrowing. But what we're going to do is make sure that with any money we have, we pay the principal and interest to our creditors. And let me ask you this question. We have a number of creditors. My understanding is that 60% of our debt is to foreign creditors. Is that correct? I think
I had 47% of total debt is held by foreign holdings.
you say 47%. My understanding is it's closer to 60%, but let's say it's somewhere between 47 to 60%.
I think there are two different classes of debt. There's the debt held by the public.
I understand.
It would be a larger percentage, so I think...
Privately held debt. Privately, not held publicly, not Social Security.
I'm not certain that number sounds right to me, though, sir.
So 60% of our privately held debt is held by foreign creditors. So China, and most of that is China, Japan, other countries like that, Iran, other countries that hold American bonds. Under this legislation, we would be required to first pay to those foreign creditors the principal and interest that we owe them on the bonds that they have, the credit we owe that they have out for us, before we take care of anything else, which would include payments to veterans.
Time for the
We owe them a
gentleman's
debt. To our researchers.
Yeah, let him go
So,
for 2 seconds.
if I could just conclude then and say, you're prioritizing paying foreign creditors before you're prioritizing paying veterans who served our country. We owe them a debt. And that's the difficulty with this legislation. Default is default. You can't
Again,
mask it.
this is for later, when we want to debate the bill. We're
It
simply
would've been-
asking him questions about the bill
And
itself.
Mr. Chairman, it
So,
would have been easier if we could have gotten
Time-
responses quickly.
time for the
to
gentleman's
questions,
expired.
So we wouldn't have to use.
Does anybody else seek
I yield back the balance of my time.
there is no balance. Mr. Doggett is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Are you aware, in the preparation of this bill, and I think this is a very timely discussion, of the letter from the Secretary of Treasury of July 30th saying that we will hit the debt limit on October 30th?
Yes, sir.
And so this bill could become effective on Halloween in terms of what you want to accomplish, right? You want to be prepared if we hit that debt limit on October the 30th.
If we hit the debt, I mean, whether we have this bill or not, we're going to hit the debt limit.
Yes.
At the end of
If
October.
that's a certainty.
Actually, one clarification, Mr. Doggett. The Treasury Secretary said we would exhaust extraordinary measures at the end
Yes.
of October. There would still be cash balances, but to your point, we're going to reach the debt limit in October or November.
And the answer that is in this bill, as you are describing it, to hitting that debt limit, which is a certainty, just as we hit it, I think, 7 times during the administration of President George W. Bush, is to propose to do the same thing that was proposed in this committee 2 years ago in 2013 when you were over in the Budget Committee, right?
Yeah, the bill is essentially the same.
Essentially the same thing. And from analyzing that, you know that the Government Accountability Office said that the effect of doing this approach was to raise short-term borrowing costs for the United States by tens of millions of dollars, and also to raise short-term borrowing rates out in the private sector for businesses, that this was a costly bill. You're aware of that, aren't you?
Yet GAO and others have done analysis
GAO
and
and
hit the
many
debt limit.
all said there were problems. Now, when if we do this and we reach the bewitching hour at Halloween or shortly thereafter, and this bill goes into effect, the effect of forcing Treasury to prioritize the bondholders, as this bill does, is to say that you pay bondholders instead of paying bills as they come due. Is that not correct?
The bill does not address other obligations.
You're going to limit the discretion of Treasury. You're obviously fearful that the Treasury may use the proceeds at that time for something other than the purposes that you limit them to in this bill, which is paying bondholders and paying Social Security, correct?
The bill does not limit Treasury's authority. It grants new authorities to the Treasury.
Well, it's telling Treasury to prioritize, which is to choose some things over other things, and that is to pay bondholders and to make payments relative to Social Security. Is that correct?
Under current law, there's a debt limit. If we reach the debt limit, the Treasury has to confront what it's going to do. It doesn't have authority to issue new debt securities.
And you give them guidance in how to do that and what choice to make in this bill, do you not?
All this bill does is grant additional authority to the Treasury to roll over debt and pay the principal interest on that debt.
You're saying that even if this bill is approved, that the Treasury could decide, instead of paying Chinese bondholders or Saudi bondholders to pay veterans' disability benefits, that this bill does not restrict the Treasury in any way or require them to prioritize China over our veterans' disability payments. Is that your
I'm not saying that. I'm saying there's currently a debt limit. If we reach it, the Treasury confronts the issue of how it's going to meet both rolling over debt and meet other obligations. All this bill does is provide additional authority to the Treasury and a directive to the authority.
I think it's forcing them to default on these other obligations, but what the bill clearly does not do, since you've indicated there's a certainty of our hitting the limit, as we did again and again and again 7 or so times during the George W. Bush administration, there's nothing in this bill to adjust that debt limit to take into account reality that we will be there, is there? That's one thing you could do, is to simply do the same thing we did during the George W. Bush administration, and that is adjust the limit to reflect the reality of the expenditures.
The gentleman will yield. The gentleman's going beyond the scope of the bill.
Well, I just want to know, the bill
but
does not address the debt limit
The purpose of
itself.
the staff walkthrough, the gentleman's line of questioning is going beyond the scope of the bill. I think there's a misperception of this bill. I'd be happy to clear it up, but let's do that when we're striking.
All right, then let me make another query. When this bill was in essentially the same form introduced in 2013, it dealt only with bondholders and not with Social Security at all. Isn't that correct?
I'm not familiar with the way the bill, I've only looked at the bill as reported by the committee and passed by the House.
Well, I can assure you that it was, before it was brought to this committee, and for political reasons, there was a conclusion that there was no way the bill could stand unless something was done for Social Security and the bonds that
The gentleman's here to talk about the bill before us, not the one that was in the last Congress. The gentleman's time has expired. Anybody else seek questions? Mr. Crowley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smyth, welcome this morning. I want to press a reset button. We can. We'll just start over again a little bit. I noticed by your answers to my friend from Texas that you can answer yes or no. I would prefer that if you can do it for one side, you can do it for the other side as well. I don't have much time, so if we can just answer those questions as briefly as possible. If this bill were enacted, will this bill prioritize federal payments first to bondholders? Yes or no?
It doesn't prioritize payments. It just grants authority.
Kevin, can you ask the question for me? If I would yield to if you could get a yes.
If the gentleman will yield, I'd be happy to answer his question. It gives the Treasury the ability to go out and borrow new money. create a new instrument so that we don't default on our debt. It doesn't deal with prioritization.
Chairman, will it prioritize federal payments first to bondholders, yes or no?
No,
Why don't-
it doesn't
Chairman, you
deal
can
with
sit
that.
down here, my neck is going back and forth. If you
No.
don't mind. No, it doesn't, you're saying?
You just got a one-word answer.
Well, I would beg to differ with you. In fact, Rep. McClintock, in his introductory statement on this bill, said, this bill simply provides that if the debt limit is reached, the Treasury Secretary may continue to borrow above that limit for the sole purposes of paying interest and principal that is due. And by bondholders, this bill specifies those holding the privately held debt of the U.S. government, of which over half is held by foreign nationals like China and Japan, correct?
Correct.
Thank you. As a first. I'm curious where in the bill the benefits of veterans are protected, because in the three-page bill that I've seen, I don't see the word veteran mentioned once. So are veterans' benefits protected in this debt limit prioritization plan that you have before us here today?
The bill does not address spending authority.
So the answer is no.
The bill does not address spending authority.
I'm from Woodside,
on debt
Queens.
obligations.
The simple answer is no. My constituents want to know the answer to that question. In this bill, are veterans' payments protected under this bill?
I think I would rather not say that in the absence of
I know you don't want to say it. You don't want to say no, N-O, but they're not. So the sponsor of this bill and the Republican majority who have voted for this exact same bill previously believe we owe a greater debt to foreign banks than we owe to our own veterans. I know that's not necessarily a question to the gentleman.
Again, this,
Well,
you're
is
going
the
beyond the
language
scope of the walkthrough.
protecting seniors relying on Medicare in this bill? Do they get higher billing than foreign banks, yes or no, in terms of protection?
It doesn't deal with spending authority.
How about protecting the payment to our active duty military personnel? Did this bill provide any special prioritization treatment to our troops as it does for foreign banks and foreign nationals?
The bill does not provide prioritization.
Translation is no. So this bill will do nothing to lower our debt, but will ensure foreign nationals and foreign banks like those in China and Switzerland are paid, but our active duty military or veterans or seniors on Medicare will not be paid. Is that correct?
The bill does not prioritize payment.
Once again, for Woodside, Queens, my translation is no. I'm reading your own bill. The bill explicitly states on page 1 that, quote, the Secretary of the Treasury shall, in addition to any other authority provided by law, issue obligations under Chapter 31 of Title 31, U.S. Code, to pay with legal tender the principal and interest on obligations of the United States, end quote. So this bill should, in my opinion, be called the Pay China First Act, which we coined. This extreme Republican Congress has gone to a new level of take Americans' hard-earned tax dollars and send them overseas to help Shanghai, Zurich, and Tokyo, but not to pay our veterans' benefits, not to pay our troops overseas. I think it's deplorable. With that, I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Pasquarello.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I have a very short question to our...
Gentleman's recognized.
Welcome. Thank you for your service. As I understand the bill that is before us, the folks who sponsored this legislation claim that it only counts as a default if we fail to pay foreign and domestic investors on time and in full. This bill, as far as I can see, we've only had it a very short period of time, this bill does not prevent us from defaulting on our obligations. And it would seem to me, if we're going to be involved in facing up to what might happen in the future, this bill makes it, I think, a default, which we're trying to avoid. It would seem that this bill is making such a default more likely because it requires the Treasury to prioritize foreign bondholders over all the obligations, and that's what members have been asking about. When you can't pay all the bills because Congress failed to raise the debt limit. So my question is, does this bill make it more likely that we'll default or less likely?
Less likely.
Less likely. How?
Right now, there's a statutory limit on the debt. The Treasury says we're going to reach it sometime after the end of October. CBO says November or December. If we reach that, the Treasury has to deal with how it's going to pay various obligations. This bill grants the Treasury Secretary the authority to repay all debt obligations and the debt service on it. So it provides additional authority to avoid a default. It doesn't make it easier to default. It ensures we don't default to bondholders, to our creditors.
What's the relationship between the default and the debt limit?
When you reach the debt limit, the Treasury has a challenge in terms of it has obligations both to roll over debt and to meet spending that Congress has written into laws, appropriation laws and entitlement laws. When it confronts that situation, it's got to make a judgment of what it's going to pay. And that's what occurs when we reach the debt limit, and Congress has to debate that. This bill doesn't address the debt limit. It just provides authority to allow the Secretary of Treasury to roll over debt and to pay the debt service on those obligations.
But doesn't it make any sense, and my final question is this, that we should be using our energy to avoid default and avoid dealing with the situation if we do not raise that debt limit? I know essentially this is very different than the debt limit, but we're trying to avoid not being able to pay our bills. You're hoping that the Treasury has the money to pay these bills under any circumstances, under any legislation. And it would seem to me that the bill, as I read it, and I understand what you just said, makes it more likely that we will default on our obligations. That's all I'm saying. I understand what you said, too.
Time.
I yield
Gentleman
back.
yields back. Mr. Thompson, do you have a question?
Yes, I do.
Gentleman's
Thank you,
recognized.
Mr. Chairman, for recognizing me. Thank you for your efforts to try and answer our questions. How do you define all debt obligations?
Be any debt issued by the Department of the Treasury. There's some other debt obligations that are issued by other agencies, but those are small. Generally, our financing is concentrated in the Department of the Treasury.
So you in response to, I think, Mr. Pascrell's question, you said that this will allow Treasury to meet all of its debt obligations.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So paying our military forces, is that debt obligation?
That is not a debt obligation. That's another obligation. This bill focuses just on debt obligations.
Just so I'm clear, small businesses who do work for the government, is that a debt obligation?
No, it's not a debt obligation.
School lunch programs, is that a debt
That is
obligation?
spending authority. That's separate from
Okay.
the process the Treasury goes
But it's not a
through
debt
to finance.
obligation.
The Treasury has to finance that spending. And
Okay.
the way it does that is by collecting revenues.
I understand.
And borrowing money. This bill just deals with
I understand,
debt
reclaiming my time, but paying for the school lunch program is not a debt obligation,
no,
okay? Paying for first responders, is that a debt obligation?
no.
Paying for veterans?
Is the gentleman going to go through the entire federal budget and ask
No.
the same question?
No, I'm just going to ask a couple.
I'll take time
You're about
and
6
yield
into it.
so you can go.
Reclaiming my time. Veterans, is that a debt obligation?
It's spending authority, not a debt obligation.
Not a debt obligation. So what is debt service?
Debt service is the interest on our debt.
So it's the interest on our debt. So when we borrow money from the bondholders, the interest we pay them, that's what would be required to be paid.
Yes, sir.
So in essence, bondholders get their interest on their rate. The military, small businesses, schools, first responders, veterans, they get default. They get nothing. This bill protects the bondholders, not the American people.
This bill doesn't address spending authority. That's an issue that Congress will have to confront.
I'd like to yield my remaining time to Mr. Becerra.
Thank the gentleman for yielding.
Ms. Kine, do you have a Did you, yeah, a gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, he yielded.
Oh, my bad, I apologize, we were having a conversation here. Did the gentleman want to yield his 2 minutes and 12 seconds to somebody?
Yes, he.
Okay. Mr. Becerra is recognized.
Thank you. I lost a half a minute in doing that, Mr. Chairman.
It's all part of the plan.
Yeah, I understand. I know. Very clear. We see that. So, Mr. Smyth, I think it's becoming clear now. I think you may want to correct your response to one thing, because you said that there was no requirement under this legislation that the Treasury Department, meaning our government, do anything as far as paying our creditors, including the foreign creditors, before anybody else. The language that's used in the legislation that Mr. Crowley read earlier uses the word shall, which is a mandatory action by government, shall issue obligations. What does it mean to issue obligations? That means to borrow money, to put out a certificate, treasury certificate that lets us borrow money, correct?
The bill does not grant
I
authority.
didn't ask, I asked you, what does it mean to issue obligations?
The bill grants Treasury the authority to issue obligations to roll over existing
I
debt.
understand.
and
I'm
pay the
asking
debt
you,
service on it.
Mr. Smyth, I'm asking you a simple, very simple question. What does it mean to issue obligations? To borrow money?
Correct.
Okay. So when this legislation says we shall issue obligations, that, if this becomes law, then Treasury must issue obligations, correct?
Yes, sir, to roll over the debt and pay debt service.
Okay. Now that's the tricky part. That's the sneaky part about this. To roll over obligations, that's another way of saying, I'm going to borrow to pay off the borrowing, right? But under this legislation as well, what's also very interesting is that in the final section, the second section, you actually then describe this borrowing to pay borrowing as not real borrowing that we have to count towards paying off the debt. The more we borrow, the greater the debt. But this bill does something very clever. It says we're going to borrow to pay off the borrowing, but we're not going to count this new borrowing as part of the borrowing that leads us to reach the default limit. And so it never counts towards the default limit.
Time for
but it
gentleman's
does
expired.
require you to pay that.
Time
over
for gentleman's
veterans,
expired. Mr.
schools,
Kind, do you seek?
And the rest. I still have 7 seconds. I had
No, you
7
don't.
seconds, Mr. Chairman. And so
We're gonna-
that's the point, is you are
Gentleman's had the second crack. Gentleman's time has expired.
you're
Kind is
hiding the borrowing that you do to pay off borrowing.
Mr. Kind, if you want to get time from him, you can do so. Mr. Kind is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smith, technical question. It's my understanding in reading the legislation, this only directs the Treasury to make payments on our bondholders, both principal and interest payments. Is that correct?
And Social Security.
And
bonds held by
Social Security Trust
Yes,
Fund.
sir.
Right. And it also allows Treasury to roll over new debt in order to pay the current debt. Is that correct?
The debt service on it.
Yeah, so they can.
Treasury wouldn't need authority. When you roll over debt, it doesn't change your total debt level. You redeem a bond, the debt goes down, you replace it with a new bond, and the debt is right back where it is. Now, the debt service,
So it'd be a new debt obligation they'd create in order to pay off current
Yes,
debt
sir.
obligations. Is that correct?
yes.
Do you know how much in interest we're currently paying on our bondholders every year in the federal budget? Is it roughly 200 billion or so?
I think I've got 200, it's a little over 200 billion.
Yeah, all right, let's just assume it's a little over 200 billion.
That's on debt held by the
My
public. That's-
read of the
that's not total
legislation
debt.
is if currently Treasury is using some general revenue in order to make those interest payments of slightly over 200 billion, this legislation will give Treasury permission that instead of using general revenue, they can issue new bond or debt obligations to pay it. And according to my reading, that would free up over 200 billion that can then be applied to discretionary spending in the federal budget. Is that a
No,
correct
sir.
reading of the legislation?
No, sir. I think the bill only goes into effect when you reach the debt limit. And it then says any debt issued above that to pay interest is exempt. It doesn't create room. It just exempts any debt issued above the
Yeah,
debt
but
limit.
if the
for
Treasury
debt service.
today is using general revenue to make interest payments on the bond, we're directing Treasury now that instead of doing that, they can issue new debt obligations to pay those bondholders, and that, to me, would free up money then that could go to the discretionary side
Not
of the
until
federal
they reach-
budget.
What they've done now, not until they reach the debt limit. The way the bill's drafted is you first have to reach the debt limit. You have no more room.
Right.
Now Treasury does have
Let me ask you about that aspect then. Can you sit there and assure us that at some point, I mean, we're only making sure that the bondholders are made whole, principal and interest, but The other financial obligations that we have under the federal government is not touched by this legislation. But at some point, if this Congress doesn't act and pay all our bills, not just the bondholders, but all our bills, can you sit there today and assure this committee that the credit rating agencies aren't going to take adverse action on our rating as a nation if we're defaulting in certain financial obligations, but not defaulting on our bond obligations?
The question's beyond the scope. The
No, I'm
gentleman
asking-
cannot speak on behalf of the credit rating
Important
agencies.
question,
The gentleman's
Mr.
answering
Chairman,
questions as
and
to the
I'm
contents
wondering
of
if
the
he
bill.
has some technical expertise to tell us.
The gentleman cannot speak on behalf of the credit rating agencies.
And that's my point, Mr. Chairman, really. When you get to the heart of this, a default is a default is a default. And the bond market, the credit rating agencies, the American people, and the international community is going to view a default by the United States government for the first time in our nation's history as a very bad thing.
I would
Now, I
encourage-
can't sit here with 100% certainty and tell you that that's going to happen. But you can't sit there today and tell me with 100% certainty that that won't be the reaction of the international community, and we're not going to get hammered with higher bond expenses and a greater demand by investors who are going to ask for a higher premium because we decided for the first time to start defaulting on our financial obligations, even if it's not bonds, but if it's anywhere else. Why do we want to go down that road?
Gentleman-
Why do we want to take that chance?
Gentlemen,
And that's what
gentlemen,
we're-
yield.
that's
We are
what
in
you're
the
doing with
staff
this
walkthrough
legislation.
period right now. We're not doing amendments. We're not striking the last word. We're in staff walkthrough. Save it for the debate.
Well-
This is technical questions. This is staff walkthrough. Save it for
And I
the
was
debate.
asking our technical expert whether or not he could give us a reading on what the credit rating agencies would do.
That's
in
beyond the
response
scope
to
of this bill.
All right, fair enough.
Since there being no further questions, are there any amendments? Oh, Mr. Davis, do you seek to ask a question on the legislation? Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, it appears to me that this bill is more of a plan for default rather than a plan to prevent default. The bill has a title, the Default Prevention Act. The Secretary of the Treasury is currently using extraordinary measures to raise enough money to pay obligations authorized by Congress, since he can no longer raise money by issuing debt. The bill only prevents default on Treasury bonds, not on the millions of other legal obligations that our government honors each and every day. 2 years ago, the House passed H.R. 807, the so-called Full Faith and Credit Act, rather than acting promptly to raise the debt limit and pay all our bills. The Council on Economic Advisors estimates that Congress's failure to act responsibly on the debt limit combined with the government shutdown cost us 120,000 jobs. The Government Accountability Office recently published a report which found that the 2013 default threats made investors significantly more wary of buying short-term Treasury bonds than they had ever been in the past, which increased our interest cost and also increased the cost of borrowing for millions of American home and business owners. Would you agree with this assessment by the GAO?
I think the GAO's assessment and the other assessments were in a situation where there wasn't the authority in this bill, that would be in this bill, to ensure we don't default on bondholders. So I think it's a different situation under this bill than what GAO and those other studies assessed.
Thank you very much. It seems to me that H.R. 692 is the same as H.R. 807, except new title, same wine, new bottle. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any other questions? There being none, are there any amendments? There being no amendments, does anyone seek to strike the last word? Let's go with Mr. Levin, and then we're going to bounce it back and forth. Mr. Levin's recognized.
I just want to to read the list in terms of the debt holders. This is an unartful dodge, this whole effort. It's going nowhere, but the trouble with it is it really obscures what the issue is, and that is to take action now in terms of the national debt. That's what this is really all about. So in terms of the bondholders, as I understand it, the privately held debt that includes much in the hands of China is about 11 trillion. The Social Security debt is a bit under 3 trillion. So here are, as I understand it, the other trust funds with bonds that would not be covered by this. The Airport and Airway Trust Fund, the Deposit Insurance Fund, the Employees Life Insurance Fund, the Exchange Stabilization Fund, the Federal Employees Retirement Fund, the Federal Hospital Insurance Fund, the Federal Savings and Loan Corporation Resolution Fund, the Federal Supplementary Medical Insurance Trust Fund, the Highway Trust Fund, the National Service Life Insurance Fund, the Postal Service Fund, the Railroad Retirement Fund, the Unemployment Trust Fund. So maybe you're not the one who should be on the spot. You're the technician. But you're there, and somebody needs to defend this. So when it's said there's no prioritization, that's not true. There is a prioritization in terms of the bondholders. And it's also true that a very substantial amount of this is held by bondholders from places like China and other countries. So instead of facing up to the debt and the debt limit that is coming within a couple months, I don't know who gave the instructions to the majority on this committee, but it really diverts attention from the responsibility of this committee and this Congress and the Republican majority to face up to it. Because you're trying to do a good job as a technician. What you can't explain is why veterans who are now in combat would not be assured of pay, while bondholders from China and other places would be. This is indefensible for this Congress and this government. Indefensible. And for you to say this is limited when there isn't action on everything that matters may meet your requirements as a technician, but we are getting you to squirm because my colleagues on the Republican side seem to not be squirming but trying to divert attention from what really is the issue here, and that is our responsibility to act on the debt limit. So all of these other trust funds aren't covered by this bill. Isn't that true?
The bill only covers debt held by the public and debt held by the Social Security Trust Fund.
Okay, so I asked you a question, and the other trust funds that I mentioned aren't covered by this bill. Isn't that true?
There is $13.1 trillion in debt held by the public and $2.8 trillion held by the Social Security Trust Fund. That comes to $15.9 trillion. That's about 88% of the total debt that Treasury is subject to the limit the Treasury's issued. So there is debt held by the trust funds. The thing is, for the other trust funds, when they redeem their debt, that goes down. When they redeem the debt, so the Treasury goes out and borrows money, that increases the debt. It doesn't affect the debt that's subject to the limit when Treasury needs to redeem that debt to make payments for whether it be airports, highways, unemployment. It has no net effect to redeem that debt and pay those obligations.
Yeah, but the answer to my question is whether there are others. The answer to that is yes.
There are others, yes, sir.
Thank you. Hey, you, Pat.
Mr. Brady, recognized for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, this issue is a pretty mature one. We know the positions on here. I know it upsets some people because it takes away a favorite scare tactic to talk about defaulting on our debt when no one believes America should default on its debt. Opponents intentionally confuse the difference between the debt we owe as a nation and our operating expenses. Again, part of a political scare tactic. And what they won't talk to you about is that a lot of Americans have loaned America money as well. Families who are saving and investing for retirement, pension funds that hope to make good on their promises to American workers, local small businesses and local community banks that depend on America paying back its loans to make sure they can continue to operate. The truth is, what this does is ensure that there's no discussion at all about defaulting on our debt. And in fact, it allows Congress and the President to come together to deal, again, not just with how we live within our means, but how we start paying down this dangerous level of debt. And presidents of both parties and members of Congress of both parties have used the debt limit discussions responsibly to change the way government spends, to start getting more control over our national debt. I think it's important to have that discussion responsibly because both parties are responsible for this debt. One more than others, but both parties. Since 1947, in real apples-to-apple dollars, Democrats have run up 70% of the gross debt of America. Of publicly held debt, what we owe each other, it's even higher, 80%, nearly 80%. But that doesn't absolve either party from sitting down and figuring out how we address our debt issues as a nation. And I think it's critically important, as we go forward on this issue, we have a clear choice. If you support defaulting on America's debt, vote no. It's easy. Just step forward and vote no. But if you believe this should be taken off the table, that there should be certainty for all those who have loaned America money so we can have a responsible, prudent discussion on how we tackle the debt, clearly the answer on this vote is yes, and I would urge that vote. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Let's move to strike the last word. Mr. Rangel is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my apologies to staff for having to respond to a very difficult political situation, but you weren't drafted, and you're doing a pretty good job. I get it. Instead of talking about putting lipstick on a pig, I should have said, the name of this bill is How to Avoid Using the Word Default. How to say that you're avoiding default. And you do that by saying, I'm going to let you borrow some more money, so therefore you'll be able not to default. But you have to do certain things. The first thing is that you can only use this to pay off your debt. And that's where your debt obligations are. For the rest of the appropriations, but are not debt obligations, you figure it out, like the gentleman from Texas says, negotiate it. It's almost like I told some of my colleagues, a company is about to go bankrupt. Everyone thinks it, they're not investing in them, but you give them an offer they can't refuse. You don't want to go into bankruptcy, I'm going to lend you some money. But you have restrictions on that money. What you have to do is pay off first the people that you borrowed the money from. You don't determine the priorities of your business or the nation. And he said, well, what am I supposed to do about my employees, my advertising, the whole thing? We have nothing to do with that. If you don't want to go bankrupt, if you don't want to default, then you have to pay these people off first. And so I understand it, Mr. Chairman. You're just saying to the United States government that if you want to talk about national security, if you want to talk about health, if you want to talk about veterans, if you want to talk about anything else, you got the wrong bill. This bill is dealing with default and default only, and if the Treasury Department does not pay off China and the public debt, then you're going to have to default. We're giving you an opportunity. The Republicans are giving us a great opportunity to avoid saying you're defaulting. Now, how many people are going to lose their lives because of health care? That's not a debt problem. We don't owe America all of these services. We owe China, and we owe the bondholders, and we owe the investors. I get it. The rest of America and its security, its health, is up to Republicans and Democrats to get together and, quote, work out something. So I don't know whether you have an opportunity to respond, but I think that's a better way to express it. You know, I think that's a better way to say it, and I get it.
All right.
It's to avoid default by cutting the throat of the men and women that have invested not money, but their whole lives in this great nation of ours. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anybody else seek to strike the last word? Mr. McDermott, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing a football to the field. I've been on the Ways and Means Committee for 25 years, and over the years, I've seen my fair share of debt ceiling and government shutdown fights, so let me be really blunt for a second. These continued battles over the debt ceiling is one of the stupidest things we do on this committee. We've got to stop messing with America's credit. I was recently in Australia and had a dialogue between Australia and the United States, and the question kept coming up, what's going on fiscally in the United States? What's the Congress doing? Where are you going? What's happening? Well, for the people sitting at home, what we're doing here may not seem like anything, but this legislation is a marker. The Republicans are getting ready to default on the nation's debt. Now, they want to put this in place so they don't have to talk about it when the time comes. They'll say, we've taken care of all this, and there's not going to be any default. But the fact is, they're getting ready for it. They wouldn't be putting this bill in if they weren't getting ready for the default. They are once again pushing the government and our economy to the brink just to demonstrate their conservative credentials. Now, let's get one thing clear. Raising the debt ceiling does not lead to more government spending. Despite what my colleagues on the other side may say, increasing the debt ceiling does not enlarge the financial commitments. Remember, Congress sets the nation's financial commitments. Instead of debt ceiling allows the government to fund those obligations already legislated by the Congress. The chairman says, well, we're leaving that other stuff to the appropriations. We are in September, and the Republicans in the House and Senate are in control, and they have not moved one single of the 11 appropriations bills. Not one single one. They're saying we're going to keep spending, and then we'll slip in a CR one of these days, and we'll keep on spending. We're not going to deal with this. But we want to make sure that the bondholders feel good. Now, the bill we're discussing provides for an orderly way for the government led by the Congress, led by the Republicans, who can't get their act together and not raise the debt limit. My colleagues would offer a fairy tale that this bill will allow for the prioritization of debt obligations. But the Treasury's computers will not be able to handle this, and they've said that. The Treasury gets $100 million bills a month. $100 million. And this bill says, well, pick and choose out of those $100 million which ones you want to pay. Only pay the bondholders. Don't pay the hospitals. Don't pay the soldiers. Don't pay the firefighters, the people fighting forest fires all over this country, in my state. Don't pay them. Just search through that $100 billion bills and find the ones for China and Japan and the bondholders. Now, the Republicans say they're the party of business, but threatening the credit is certainly not good for business. And do not be fooled, this bill takes us closer to default by providing a false sense of security to Americans everywhere that it'll be okay when default happens. What will happen? Well, we saw that before. We saw it in 2011 when the country neared breaching the debt limit. The stock market plunged. It fell 2,000 points in the final days of July through early August. The cost of credit will increase. If the government defaults and has to pay higher interest rates on its debt, the cost of capital for business will increase. This will increase the lending costs, lending the businesses use to pay salaries and suppliers, and it may cause some of them to go out of business. This will lead to an increase in unemployment if we default. Finally, this back and forth it's not making us safer. The Republicans claim to represent the interest of business, to understand business, and yet what they do is absolutely the opposite. Let's vote no on this bill.
Gentleman brought it right within the 5-minute mark. Congratulations. Does anybody else move to strike the last word? Mr. Becerra. I'm just going to go down the line.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Default is default. And as much as we may watch as some try to explain it away, we have that obligation. When we went to war in the early 2000s, President Bush committed us to that endeavor, and we owe those soldiers, we owe all those people who helped feed them, train them, equip them. That debt we have to pay, and it was substantially over $1 trillion. We owe these repayments. And so when you put at risk, for the first time in our history, the repayment of those obligations, you're essentially saying that you're putting the full faith and credit of America, which has never failed, on the line. And this bill, as clever as it tries to do it, is still nothing different than borrowing to avoid defaulting. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't do anything to cover that obligation with real money. And so we run into this situation where it tries to avoid the circumstance of saying, well, we're not prioritizing. We're not saying we're going to pay our creditors like China before we pay veterans, our hospitals, our firefighters, our soldiers. The way it does it is by saying, well, we don't deal with our veterans, our firefighters, our soldiers. We only deal with our creditors. So the only thing this bill says is you have to pay our creditors, the biggest of whom is China. Who are not creditors? And who are the people who don't hold debt obligations in the American, with the American government? Well, soldiers don't hold debt obligations. Firefighters don't hold debt obligations. Veterans don't hold debt obligations. Hospitals who treat our infirm don't hold debt obligations. Medicare recipients, by the way, don't hold debt obligations. All of them are children, whom we say we must educate, don't hold debt obligations. So the creditors, like China, will get their payment under this bill, but because we don't mention any of those veterans, firefighters, children, our health researchers who are developing the next cures for cancer or Alzheimer's, they don't hold debt obligations. They don't get paid. But our creditors do, because they let us borrow money. And they should get paid, but they should not get paid over our seniors, our children, our soldiers, our first responders. And so rather than play this game, let's not default on our debt ever. And let's not prepare for another government shutdown or another brink of disaster in defaulting on our debt. This is so eerily familiar to 2013, so eerily familiar with 2011. And here we go again. This constant regurgitation of this game of taking us to the very brink, which causes interest rates to go up, which causes so many Americans to have unease about what their mortgage payment will be next month because interest rates may go up. This is not a way to do it. And you can't cloak it by saying we're going to borrow money to pay borrowed money, and then saying that borrowed money that we use to pay borrowed money won't count towards the bill, the mountain of debt we have in borrowed money. It's too circular. Come on. Let's be real. The American public is frustrated. Let's get to work. Let's get this done, and we can do it. We've done it before. We did it under George Bush, as Mr. Doggett mentioned, 7 times. We had to deal with the fact that we had obligations that were due for past debts. We're not talking about the future. We're talking about past debts. If you didn't like the Iraq War and if we don't want to pay it back, then you shouldn't have voted for it. If you don't think we should default on debts today, then you shouldn't be for Bush tax cuts that siphon off trillions of dollars from our ability to pay our existing and our past debts. And so we can take care of this. We shouldn't just cloak it behind something that says we can borrow money to pay borrowed money, then say that that borrowed money isn't part of that borrowed money that's created this mountain of debt. And don't say that it's okay, veterans and seniors and everyone else will be fine, when the only thing that this bill mentions is creditors like China who will be assured that they will be paid. With that, I yield back the balance.
Anybody else move to strike the last word? Mr. Lewis is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as I said before, we have been down this path, down this highway. I've said it before and I said again. The United States of America must pay all of our bills as they become due. I oppose this Pay China First legislation. We do not pick and choose winners over losers, and I will not. We as a Congress must not choose paying China over American veterans. We cannot choose to pay China before sending Social Security checks. We cannot choose China over American military personnel. We cannot choose China over food and nutrition programs for low-income American families. This legislation was a bad idea in 2013, then, and is a terrible and bad idea right now. This committee must do better. It can do better. There's only one option, and that option is for the United States of America to pay its bill in the order they are received. Mr. Chairman, this is the right thing to do. We have a moral obligation and a mission to pay our bills and pay them on time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I saw hands going to Mr. Doggett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The willingness of Republicans to waste taxpayer money, to literally fritter it away with one manufactured crisis after another, a shutdown, a fiscal cliff, a default, is nothing short of amazing. I think what this hearing should do for the American people is to put a giant caution light out there of what lies ahead over the next couple of months. Indeed, it probably rises to the level of being a giant red light to say, stop. Don't do this to America and to the American economy and to American families once again, as you have done repeatedly. Republicans are simply unable to stand up to their shutdown caucus, and that's where we're headed. I think to be bipartisan about it, we ought to look at what Republicans have said about Republicans on the issue before us today. The former Congressional Budget Office Director, Douglas Holtz-Eakin, who's come before this committee a number of times, said this, and I quote, "On their own, Republicans cannot pass a debt limit increase, period. They could have a debt limit bill that closed every federal agency, and it would not pass the House." I could not have said it better than what this Republican spokesperson had to say about it. They know that come Halloween, we have reached the debt limit, and yet they are incapable of doing what this Congress voted to do 7 times for George W. Bush, 18 times for Ronald Reagan, because they want to force another crisis. These crises are not free. As the staff witness conceded, the Government Accountability Office looked at this same bill when it was passed through this committee before, when we faced the possibility of taking this approach before, and it cost us tens of millions of taxpayer dollars to do what is being proposed today. It costs much more to businesses in the private sector who had their borrowing costs increased. And yet we're repeating the very same thing that did not work, that was costly before, because they cannot say no to the shutdown caucus. To turn to another Republican on this, Tony Frato, back in when we considered this bill in 2013, who was a Bush administration official, said that, quote, prioritization is impossible. Is the government really going to be in the position of withholding benefits, salaries, rent, contract payments in order to pay off Treasury bondholders? There are 80 to 100 million payments per month that the Treasury makes. And this is really saying pick and choose among those payments and put the folks that hold the bonds, whether they're in Shanghai or Riyadh or on Wall Street, ahead of everyone else. Keith Hennessy, a former Bush administration economist, wrote, "The first step to becoming a banana republic. It would turn our economy into a bloody mess if we have a default," and that's what is being proposed. This is the Default Cover Act that is proposed here. And what of the effect of telling Treasury, yes, you can borrow more, but you can only pay those bondholders in Shanghai or wherever they may be, and you can only pay on Social Security bonds, but you can't do anything else? Well, as Mr. Rangel indicated, there's some people that invested in America. They invested not by buying a Treasury bond, but they invested with their lives. And I can tell you, representing Military City down there in San Antonio, I've got a lot of veterans who gave their limbs, who gave their lives, whose families have sacrificed, and every one of those people who receives a veteran's disability check is put in a second-class position relative to these bondholders in China or wherever. We say through this bill, not with my vote, of course, but it is said through this bill, that those veterans who are receiving their disability check, Treasury doesn't prioritize that. It prioritizes paying bondholders. Every young person in this country who is investing in this country by getting the education to be able to achieve their full God-given potential and contribute back to our economy, they're investing in America, but they're not a bondholder, though they have a big stake in the future of America, and their Pell Grants, they won't be there. And one after another
Time for the gentleman is
group
expired.
of Americans are cut out and denied
Time for the
by
gentleman
this bill.
expired. Does Mr. Thompson's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I couldn't help but note the irony that we're debating this bill and possible default on the morning after many of us on this committee sat over at the Library of Congress and heard Ron Chernow talk about Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of our Treasury, and how he refused after the Revolution to allow America to default on any of its debts. And here we are today trying to figure out some sort of scheme whereby we get to default without calling it default. Make no mistake, I'm more than willing to cut spending where it's deserved, but I'm not willing to vote for a bill that lays out a roadmap for us to get to default. No matter what you call it, no matter how you talk around it, default by any name is still default. And in this particular case, the default falls squarely on the shoulders of those in the military who are serving in harm's way, falls squarely on the shoulders of the small businesses who do work for the federal government, do work in every one of our congressional districts, paving roads, building airports, whatever it might be. Falls squarely on the shoulders of our school districts across the country, our first responders across the country, and as my colleague Mr. Doggett pointed out, those veterans who didn't invest in America by buying bonds, but invested in America by answering their call to duty. Many of them now dependent upon the federal government for their medical care, in some instances their disability payments, and this default is going to hit them square between the eyes, and that's wrong. This legislation would tell Treasury that they have to pay China before they pay our troops in harm's way. Tell Treasury would have to pay China before they pay our first responders. This is wrong, and we should vote this measure down. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Anybody else speak? Mr. Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me pick up on the point that I raised earlier about how fragile our national economy is and the events internationally that are now having great impact. As I noted before, in terms of fluctuations in the stock market now almost daily, the price of oil, you can see even with the growth patterns, some quarters of 2% growth, all that does is replace the number of people who have left the marketplace. There are 8 million people that are still outside of the job market. We really don't have great detail or idea of where they left after the recession. And I think that the point here that is worth emphasizing, that when we receive our credit card statement monthly, despite the fact that one might have purchased something at a sporting goods store or LL Bean or some other entity, the credit card statement doesn't say you have the luxury of just paying one of those obligations. It says that you get the statement, there is a minimum payment, and to avoid higher interest charges, you can make a larger payment. And I think that's sort of the paradigm that is being discussed here, that we don't get to pick and choose our obligations. The credit statement is one that the rest of the world really still abides by. I hear people talk about the price of the dollar from time to time, and what's stunning to me is for all of us who have had a chance to travel on this committee and others internationally, none of us have ever been any place where that dollar wasn't accepted, because they know the full faith and credit of the United States stands behind that small transaction. And I think that this calls attention to really the substantial changes that have occurred in the Republican Party, not just my time in Congress, but now over a long period of time, where at one time, credit was the cornerstone, and a good credit rating, the cornerstone of Republican economics. They believed in that in an unyielding manner, that we would accept the principles of the free market, but nonetheless, your bills had to be paid. So for us to entertain this sort of an initiative today violates the longtime principles of the Republican Party that I knew, particularly growing up in New England. I must tell you, pay your bills and balance budgets. And they avoided just about all the other controversies. So today we're moving away from those principles. We're moving to a position that we saw what happened when $24 billion was just arbitrarily removed from the American economy. And to send this message to markets right now is further going to cause great consternation nationally and internationally.
Time for the gentleman has expired. Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me first commend Mr. Smyth and let him know that certainly you're feeling the frustration on our side of the aisle, but I want to assure you that it's nothing personal, and certainly you have a job and a task, and to the chairman's credit, a very narrowly drafted bill that you are responding to. What we have here, perhaps, is a failure to communicate, as they said in Cool Hand Luke. Beyond that, what we have here, and I admire the restraint on the other side of the aisle, no one has spoken on this, on the other side of the aisle. Why? Because even though there's the confluence of policy and deep and abiding concern, and I think obviously the issue of default, this is not about default. This is about politics. And the politics here are pretty clear. And that's nothing that staffs on either side should be dealing with and usually don't. So I commend you for adhering to the rigors of what you've been asked to do and the responsibility for which you're charged. Now, this is a great committee, and many people on this committee on both sides of the aisle are thoughtful. I'm struck by the fact that no one on the other side of the aisle has much to say, but I understand why. Here's the politics, and I think this is what the American people find frustrating. And not necessarily on this committee, but certainly in the conference. The Speaker is under siege. He's threatened to be purged from his seat. Speaker Boehner is a reasonable and caring person. There is much consternation going on in the conference. And along with that consternation is a presidential election. And along with a presidential election comes pledges and people taking positions, such as shutting down the government over Planned Parenthood. And while that's not related very narrowly to anything that's before you, it is what's the underpinnings for what's driving rational, thoughtful people to come up with some way to deal with this issue so that we can move forward and take on the appearance that we're not defaulting. But as Ron Kind said, default is default is default. As Richie Neal has said, that has deep-seated consequences. I think everybody on this committee understands that. I also believe that at the core, coming up with this kind of legislation or this kind of legislative approach is akin to the old Animal House solution after they've destroyed the Lincoln loaned to Flounder by his brother, and it's destroyed sitting there in the garage, and Otter proposes, hey, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll say, you took good care of this all the while. And lo and behold, we woke up the next morning and, oh, it was gone. And then the insurance will pay for it. And then Flounder asks, will that work? And Otter responds, no, but it beats the truth. And so the truth is that default is default is default. What we have here is the conflux of policy interfering with politics, and so we have this debate, which is why America is thoroughly frustrated with the United States Congress and anything that we attempt to do constructively. Everybody on this committee knows what the right thing to do is. The attempt here is to prevent a default, but everybody on that side also knows that default is default is default. I yield back.
Anyone else seek to strike the last word? Mr. Kind is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to be brief because I kind of emphasize this point in my first comments. But here's my concern, Mr. Chairman. You know, this legislation is clearly meant to take care of the bondholders, the principal and interest obligations to them. Fine. But if this legislation makes it more politically convenient in the future for this Congress to default on some of our financial obligations, I'm betting there's going to be an adverse reaction in the marketplace. I'm betting we're going to get hammered by credit agencies. I'm betting that investors are going to be demanding a higher premium. I'm betting our borrowing costs, interest charges are going to go up. And it's been one of the saving graces in recent years that interest payments on bondholders have been so low and that our deficits haven't been exploding. But if we mess with this for the first time in our nation's history and play with the full faith and credit of the United States government, I'm fearful that there's going to be a serious financial penalty in doing that. Now, I can't sit here and tell all my colleagues I'm saying that with 100% certitude, but I'm also believing that no one on this dais can tell me with 100% certitude that that won't happen. And that's really the point, is we ought not go down this road where we have never gone before and risk the full faith and credit of the United States of America and the fact that we are the premium reserve currency in the world right now by trying to thread the needle on our financial obligations, by just trying to take care of the bondholders first and foremost. Both parties bear responsibility for the fiscal mess we're in right now. On our side, we haven't been the best in oversight and reforming certain spending programs, tightening our belt and reining in unnecessary spending. But your side hasn't had clean hands on this either, not in backing 2 wars that weren't paid for, 2 huge tax cuts that weren't paid for, a new prescription drug plan that wasn't paid for. And just this year alone, according to my staff calculations, with legislation that this Republican majority has passed in the House this year, would have added $1.5 trillion to the deficit. Repealing the Affordable Care Act, according to the CBO, $110 billion cost not paid for, not offset on your side. What else do we have? SGR repeal. There was bipartisan support. But at the end of the day, it was $141 billion adding to the deficit because it wasn't completely paid for. The R&D tax credit expansion, $182 billion. You all supported it, not a nickel of it offset. The estate tax repeal, $295 billion, not a nickel of it offset. Goes right to deficit spending. And unfortunately, your own appointed CBO director in August came out and said, guess what? Tax cuts don't pay for themselves. He was very clear in his first public press conference when he was asked that question. And this is one of the chief economic advisors to President George W. Bush. And now he's running our CBO. And he came out and said, tax cuts don't pay for themselves. And you guys have a tendency to bring popular tax relief after popular tax relief, not offsetting it, adding it to the deficit. So let's not get too cute here as far as who's responsible and who's trying to be more fiscally responsible in dealing with our obligations. What we ought to be doing, instead of wasting time all day today to try to thread the needle on our financial obligations here, we ought to be having serious bipartisan discussions on a long-term deficit reduction agreement, with both sides having to take some tough choices and linking arms and jumping into those icy waters together. But there are no discussions in this place about that. It is dead in the water. Instead, we're trying to play games with the full faith and credit of the United States of America, and this is going to come back to bite us. I'm almost confident in saying that today. So I think we ought to be very careful how we proceed on this issue and how we deal with the debt limit when it's upon us at the end of October or early November. Because I don't think people are going to be making this fine distinction that you're trying to make with this legislation today. We default, and we're going to be paying a very high price for a very long time with a lack of credibility in the international community. I yield back.
Anyone else seeking to strike last word? Mr. Pasquarello is recognized.
Director Smyth, you did a great job under the circumstances. I really sincerely mean that. You know, and you got to look at those circumstances. The 14th Amendment is pretty darn clear. The public debt of the United States shall not be questioned. It's clear. That's what it says. You didn't write it. I didn't write it. But that's what the 14th Amendment, part of the 14th Amendment says. So, we all saw the economic impact, and some of my colleagues pointed out some of this, that the past two debt ceiling crises had on our economy. In 2011, the Dow dropped over 2,000 points. We added $18.9 billion to our deficit. So those who speak cavalierly, and I've never heard anybody speak cavalierly about the debt on this committee on either side, but those who speak cavalierly about this don't know their history. In 2011, the Dow dropped 2,000 points, as I said. And for the first time in our history, the S&P downgraded our credit rating. And you know what it cost in 2013? And you know how many jobs we lost as well. And that was all when we didn't default. What would have happened if we did? The mere threat of default. And if you listen to some of this irresponsible talk, irresponsible, talk about this like, well, we're going to vote for this or that. This is serious business. I'm glad everybody in this committee treats it seriously. Irresponsible discussions of default like the one we are having partially today, both in and out of committee, were enough to do significant damage to the economy. The fact in this room, this storied committee is even discussing the idea that America might not pay its bills, that will be a deadbeat nation, is unbelievable. Unbelievable. And by the way, you ought to take a look at what we've already done this year. We added $611 billion to the debt of this country, while we feed the discussion about who's for the American people, who's not for the American people. Unpaid for. $611 billion, and we are still counting. Is that responsible? So look, both parties, Democrat and Republican, have fed the debt. We're responsible for that. We haven't done the brilliant things all the time, and I don't think you have either. And even within bondholders, Republicans have chosen to prioritize who the investors over Americans. About half the debt prioritized is owned, as we know, by foreign investors. So, you know, it's not an exaggeration to say this is, that's a cute bumper sticker, pay China first. Our economy is in a fragile period of recovery. The fall would not be a tap on the brakes. It would be, I think, slamming on the brakes. How do we stop the nonsense? Well, it's a conflict of our own creation. In 2010, the majority in Congress changed the rules to force a vote on the debt limit separate from the vote on the federal budget. You changed the rules. You did it on purpose. It wasn't an accident. And I say this with due respect, Mr. Chairman. I think you've tried to run a civil meeting today, but I say this with due respect to each person on the other side of the aisle. This party that you belong to, in deep respect to the growth of this nation, you've allowed the Tea Party to morph into your party. And that's the reality of the situation. I don't believe that each one of you is a member of the Tea Party, which you have every right to be, But we're not a deadbeat nation, and we can't act like we're one. And even in this discussion, it appears that we're looking at the reality that might be before us, just in case. So, Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, I say this. I know you're in a difficult position. You're chairman of the big, important committee, and you should be. But the fact of the matter is, we've got a deal here. The whole nation is involved here.
Time for the gentleman's expired.
Have a nice weekend.
You as well, Mr. Pasquale. Are there any other members who seek to strike last word? Mr. Crowley, would you like to speak?
I do, Mr. Chairman. Thank you
Recognize
again.
for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again, Mr. Smyth, as well. I appreciate your presence and your attempts to shed some light on the bill, albeit not to our satisfaction, I will say, but I do appreciate the difficult circumstances you're working under as well, as my colleagues have said. I also do believe that my colleague from Connecticut, Mr. Larson, his observation of the silence from the other side is deafening. The lack of debate or discussion on this. I know it's a difficult subject to talk about, because I also know that my colleagues on the side have tremendous friendships in my city, in Wall Street and in banking. And from time to time, they like to hedge their bets. They talk to me as well. And when I brought up this subject 2 years ago with them, and how damaging I thought this discussion, this debate was, they said, you know what, we do too. But, you have to understand, they have to give some red meat to the more radicals within their party, and we kind of have to wink and look the other way. They don't ever think this will ever actually come to fruition or become law. As Mr. Pasquale has said, how devastating this debate alone can be. The notion or idea that we send to investors here in the United States or overseas that the United States may very well default on its debt. In essence, declare bankruptcy. Because, Mr. Chairman, in your bill, you do direct that some payments not be made. I know, from a political standpoint, very easy target to say that members of Congress should not be paid. I believe that is in the bill. But you decide not to say that some bills ought to be paid, like veterans checks, or make sure that our military personnel are paid for, or that Medicare recipients get their checks. They don't get bonds as payments, they get checks. They can't go to a bank and say, please cash this bond. The government doesn't send bonds to people, they send checks to people. I know that there have been a number of names that have been tossed around for this bill. The Pay China First Act, that was a good one. I like that one. We came up with that one as well. How about the Government Shutdown Preparation Act. That's another good one because this is good practice in preparation for a government shutdown in default. We'll decide to pay China first. We can throw that in there. How about preparing for a Trump Presidency Act? We know how Mr. Trump likes to use bankruptcy, for instance, as a tool, which is provided under the U.S. Code to help struggling businesses hold off the debt obligations so they get themselves back into shape. But I would suggest that even for Mr. Trump, the use of bankruptcy is a tough decision to make. Tough decision. You'd have to think, even though it's a tool, a tough decision. Painful for all those employees who have to suffer because of the loss of that business. With the notion of individual Americans who have to come to a decision as to whether or not to declare personal bankruptcy and how difficult that is. Ought we not have some discussion, debate about what this bill really is about? And that is declaring America's bankruptcy and then deciding who gets paid first? How devastating the notion or idea that the United States of America would ever declare bankruptcy through default. It's unacceptable. It's unacceptable to me personally. It ought to be unacceptable to you as a party. Apparently, it is not. Apparently, you're becoming a party that Mr. Trump loves even more today when you pass this bill out of this committee. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my 1 minute and 1 second.
Does anyone else move to strike the last word? Are we ready to proceed here? All right, seeing that there are no others, I will move to strike the last word just to wrap it up. This has been an interesting debate. I'm not going to yield.
Did I strike the last word?
No, the gentleman already did. And somebody on the other side of the aisle said the Republicans are getting ready to default on debt. It's really interesting the length of the stretch of the argument people are making to justify a vote against this. Now, what happens when the government runs deficits, as we do, is we go out and we borrow money in the open market, and people will lend us their money in the form of buying a bond. That might be senior citizens, pensioners, pension funds, foreign governments, whoever. If you go down, you just go down the street. It's downtown, and you can go watch an auction. It's actually something I encourage every member of Congress to do. Go watch one of our Treasury auctions. It's quite an interesting thing to watch. Now, we all know that if, for one reason or another, the U.S. government, talk about Alexander Hamilton, the U.S. government, if we actually could not redeem a bond, then we would have a default. And we all know that it would hurt everybody, not just some people, the Chinese bondholders. It would hurt everybody. Borrowing costs would go up. Our ability to cash flow small businesses, student loans, everything would go up. And the borrowed money that is being redeemed was money borrowed for everything the government does, for paying the troops, for paying for veterans' health care, for paying for all these things the government does. This issue isn't designed to be the solution for fixing our fiscal problems, the fact that we run persistent deficits. That's what fiscal policy is about. That's what the budget Mr. Price drafted and passed through the House is all about. Making choices, balancing the budget, paying off the debt. And that's where that debate exists and occurs and ought to. What this simply says is, when we run into these moments, and the gentleman from Texas was right, we ran into these moments many times in the prior administration, as we run into it with any administration, because we're a government that has big deficits. We're going to come into these moments, and markets can get rattled, because there can be moments of doubt as to whether or not we're going to redeem our bonds. We just want to remove that doubt. We just want to say we're not going to default. And default, I understand the definition of the default. Many are attempting to stretch into all these other things as if it's a proxy fight for the fiscal fights we have around here. Default is really simple. It's not repaying your bonds. So when a bond comes due, We are simply saying Treasury can go out and renew that bond, can pay off that bond, meaning pay off the creditors plus interest. That's all this does. This is not prioritization. Prioritization would be, we would say in this bill, okay, Treasury, you pay these people first, those people second, and then the other ones third. That's not what this bill does. This bill simply says you can go out and borrow more money to pay off the expiring bonds plus interest. That's what this does. Prioritization is something that would have to be left up to the discretion of Treasury, and more importantly, we as the fiscal policy branch of government, we need to make decisions and figure out how to deal with this thing when we hit these debt limits. So all this does is say that the federal government is not going to default on its bonds. And we're giving Treasury the tools they need to prevent that default so that we don't have these runs, so that we don't have these credit problems, so that we don't have an interest rate spike, so that we don't do damage to everybody we care for, all of our constituents. That's all this does. All these other arguments, all these other justifications for not voting for this bill are really proxy arguments or proxy fights for the other issues before us, the other fiscal debates we're having. This is very narrow. If you don't want the government to default on its bonds, vote for this bill. If you want to play with fire and if you want to tempt fate by possibly having defaults, then vote against it. That's all it is. At this time, I now recognize Mr. Johnson for purposes of offering a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 692 to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 692. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Motion is agreed to. A roll call vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady? Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani? Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Meehan? Mr. Meehan, aye. Ms. Nome? Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding? Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Dold? Mr. Dold, aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel? Mr. Rangel, no. Mr. McDermott? Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Becerra? Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell's no. Mr. Crowley? Mr. Crowley, no. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Nunez? Chairman Ryan?
Yes.
Chairman Ryan, yes.
Clerk will report the vote.
24 yeas, 14 nays.
There being 24 ayes and 14 nays, the motion is agreed to. Wait,
24 yeas, 15 nays.
50, oh, there being 24 ayes and 15 nays, the motion is still agreed to. H.R. 692 is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, and that members may have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. The last order of business is a bill introduced by Mr. Marchant, H.R. 3442, the Debt Management and Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2015. Mr. Marchant, you are now recognized for an opening statement on this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will try to be brief. Thank you, first of all, for bringing the bill before the committee today, and thanks to Ranking Member Levin and his members for giving consideration of the bill. I introduced this bill with a simple aim to add more accountability and less disruption to the debt limit process, and importantly, to return the focus to finding debt reduction solutions. Members of this committee know that the national debt stands at $18 trillion. They should also know that the federal debt is at a higher percentage point now than at any point in the U.S. history, except for a brief period after World War II. If current law remains unchanged, the CBO projects federal debt held by the public would exceed 100% of revenues in 25 years, and this cannot be sustained. This legislation provides an opportunity to take an early and clear-eyed assessment of the debt well before even reaching the statutory debt limit, which was reached earlier this year in March. In advance of the statutory debt limit, the Treasury Secretary, whether Republican or Democrat, would report to this committee and the Senate Finance Committee on 3 items. The first is the Secretary would report on a comprehensive account of the national debt, future debt projections, and the administration's plans to meet those future debt obligations. Second, the Secretary would provide proposals on how to reduce the debt in the short term, the medium term, and the long term, and make proposals, if there are any, to alter the debt to GDP ratio. The Secretary would also provide projections for fiscal health to major entitlement programs and the impact of an increased debt that would have on the government spending and debt service. Third, if an administration requests multiple debt limit increases, the Secretary would submit a progress report as a status update on any prior debt reduction proposal. All these reports will be made available to the public in one central location. This is the way the American people can also be informed in detail on the nation's debt. The national debt is a shared responsibility, and it will take a shared executive legislative approach to stabilize and reduce the nation's debt. We can no longer afford to put the $18 trillion debt on autopilot. Let's deal with it head on, well in advance of crisis-related deadlines, and find a responsible measure to retire the debt before it's too late. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The ranking member is recognized for an opening statement on the bill.
Let me briefly describe why we're opposed to this. The Treasury is more than willing to come forth. You don't need to order the Secretary of the Treasury to come forth and discuss this. Secondly, we've just gone through an exercise where the majority here is trying to dodge their responsibility to address what happens if we reach the debt ceiling. By the way, Mr. Chairman, we haven't had a caucus on this, but I think I speak for everybody. I hope you bring the first bill up on the floor. I hope you do. So we can have a thorough discussion of what's going on here and how, by the way, what you said, or what was said here about all the debt holders being covered, that's really not true. I read a list of those that are not covered. So you cover Chinese debt holders, but not some others. But there's no way to hide your responsibility to face up to the coming debt ceiling problem. And your silence here won't work on the floor. So I hope very much that you will bring up this bill so we can have a full debate as to what's going on here and how you're trying to essentially divert attention from your main responsibility and the consequences if the debt ceiling is pierced. And another trouble with this bill is it doesn't say what will happen to our economy if we have another debt crisis. It doesn't require the Treasury Department or anybody else to spell out how many jobs will be lost. It doesn't spell out how much interest rates will rise. It doesn't spell out how much the GDP will contract. We've been through this before, and your playing with fire has burned the economy of this country and has burned the life savings of millions of people and the wages that they work hard to earn. So this report is totally incomplete. In terms of asking the Secretary to come here is unnecessary. I hope you'll ask him to come for a hearing here before we reach the debt ceiling. I think that would be excellent. Have him come here and testify. Bring this out into the open and not try to hide behind a bill that you've just voted for. It's an effort at evasion of responsibility. So we don't like this because it's a diversion and because it's incomplete. We've debated this a lot, so maybe we should move rather quickly. I do hope again that you'll bring the bill we just passed, or you passed, up for the floor for the fullest debate. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 3442. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will now turn to Austin Smyth, the Policy Director of the Ways and Means Committee, to provide a brief description of the bill, and I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Smyth.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Marchant has already described the bill. I can go back over it again if you like, but I was wondering to expedite the committee's business whether you want to move past the walkthrough.
I think the bill is pretty straightforward. I think the minorities had plenty of chance to look at it, and Mr. Marchant did a good job describing it, so let's leave it there. Are there any questions about the bill for Mr. Smyth? Technical questions. There being none, are there any amendments? Does the gentleman have an amendment? Would the gentleman like to strike the last word? The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. President, or Mr. Chairman.
There were no amendments, correct?
No.
So, okay. Gentleman's recognized to strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, we're in the second act of the default follies now, but I think it's important to lay out what this really says. The United States makes contracts with building contractors, guys who lay concrete. And they sign a contract and they say, we'll pay you when you've done your building. So you're done and you send the bill into the Treasury, and every highway contractor in this country, if we run up against this situation of no default, no default, the Treasury's going to say, we're not going to pay that building contractor in St. Louis, Missouri. We're not going to pay that payment contractor. And what you were doing by this kind of legislation is undermining the trust in the word of the U.S. government here in the United States. You're sort of separating, say, we don't want the world to not trust us. We'll pay our bonds to those folks. But the folks here in the United States, we don't want you to trust the word of the government anymore. Now, if a contractor in Murfreesboro, Kentucky, or Tennessee lays a mile of concrete and sends in the bill, he's got to have that money to either pay back the bank from whom he borrowed the money, or he's going to have to say to his employees, I'm sorry, guys, I can't pay you because I haven't received the money from the federal government. And if I were a contractor, I would want to say, well, you know, before I lay any concrete out here, I want my money up front. That way I'll know what the United States government is going to do. Are you serious or not? What you are doing is saying to the whole business community that if you do it, we're going to go now and we'll pay later. That we don't mean that. We're not going to pay later. We're going to pay whenever the Congress gets around to finding some money somewhere to pay the doctors, the hospitals, the pharmaceutical companies, every single provider that buys or sells goods and services to the United States government. And this is absolutely what I guess that's the Republican desire, is to erode the confidence in the federal government to solve the problems. Now, the National Road was built in 1820. That was the first time we went to a public works project and we carried it to conclusion. And we've been operating since 1820. That's almost 200 years. And you now want to say to contractors, hey, you sign a contract with us, you know, maybe yes, maybe no, you'll get your money. We're going to pay the bondholders, the guys who buy our debt bonds, but we're going to let lie in the hands of the Republican Congress that after all this time hasn't passed one single appropriation. And maybe we're going to pass a CR. That's probably how we'll get around it. And that means there'll be a whatever 3 or 5 or 6% cut in the money. And so somebody's not going to get paid, or somebody's going to get laid off, or some service we're not going to buy anymore. This is an erosion of trust in the United States government's ability to do what's necessary for the American people. And it's admission by the Republicans that that's what they're doing. We want the people to be doubtful about whether the government can do anything, because we want the private sector to do it all. We want to go back to the Pike roads that were owned before 1820 by individuals. We want to go back to all that kind of stuff where the private sector deals with everything, because you can't trust the federal government. That's what the chairman is doing by putting this bill out here. Folks, we Republicans don't trust the federal government. I do trust the federal government. We can solve the problems. We've done it before, but they've given up on the Republican side.
I think the gentleman's comments were more about the last bill than this one, but does anybody have a motion to strike the last word on this bill, the one that's before us, H.R. 3442? Seeing that there are none, I will now recognize Mr. You ready? Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 3442 to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 3442. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. I see a show of hands. A roll call vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady? Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani? Mr. Bustani, aye. Oh, the gentleman is not recorded. Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri, or Nebraska? Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Meehan? Mr. Meehan, aye. Ms. Nome? Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding? Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Dold? Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel? Mr. Rangel, no. Mr. McDermott? Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Becerra? Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley? Mr. Crowley, no. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Nunez?
Shh, committee will still come to order.
Mr. Dold? Mr. Becerra? Chairman Ryan?
Aye.
Chairman Ryan, aye.
Clerk will report the vote.
22 ayes, 14 noes.
There being 22 ayes and 14 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 3442 is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, and the members may have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. There being no further business before the committee now stands adjourned.